The snow had come early that year. By mid-October, thick drifts had already buried the narrow forest paths leading to Evelyn's cabin. She wasn't surprised. Her bones could feel the seasons shift long before the clouds ever showed signs. She'd lived in the northern woods for almost 3 decades now, and the forest rarely surprised her anymore. But what did surprise her was the sound, a faint whimper, high-pitched and trembling, like it didn't belong in this world. It came from somewhere past the edge of the frozen stream near the birch grove. Evelyn paused, one hand still on the bucket she'd just lowered into her well. Her breath puffed in front of her like a silent question mark. She listened. There it was again. That sound, fragile, not human, not quite animal, or maybe both. It reminded her of something helpless trying not to call out and failing. Evelyn left the water bucket where it stood and began walking. The snow crunched beneath her boots. She kept her pace steady, heart quiet but alert. She knew better than to rush towards strange sounds in the woods, no matter how pitiful they seemed. As she neared the grove, she dropped to a crouch. Through a tangle of scrub, she saw movement, slow and uncoordinated. A tiny figure with a patchy brown coat was fumbling at the edge of a hollow log. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. A bear cub. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its fur was wet with snowmelt, and it limped as it tried to step forward, collapsing instead. Her breath caught, not in fear, but something deeper. She scanned the area. No sough, no rustling. No warning huff from the trees. The cub was alone. That was wrong. Dangerous. Bears didn't just abandon their young. Something must have happened. She stepped forward slowly. "Hey," she whispered, the way she used to when talking to frightened foals as a young girl. The cub looked up, startled, and tried to drag itself farther back, but one of its hind legs twisted at a strange angle, and it whimpered again. Evelyn's heart clenched. She pulled off her gloves and knelt a few feet away. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly. "I'm just going to help." The cub blinked at her, eyes wide and dark. No growling, no showing of teeth, just terror and confusion. She took off her coat and approached slowly. "All right, little one," she murmured. "Let's figure this out together." The cub didn't fight. It couldn't. Its energy had faded with the cold and the pain. She bundled it in the coat, careful to avoid putting pressure on its leg, then carried it back to the cabin. It weighed more than she expected, solid muscle under matted fur, but she made it. Once inside, she stoked the fire higher and cleared a spot near the hearth. The cub lay curled in her old quilt, breathing shallow. She examined the leg, dislocated or broken, likely the latter. She didn't have a vet's equipment, but she had something just as important: time, experience, and compassion. She melted snow, added herbs she'd foraged in the fall, and cleaned the wounds as best she could. The cub whimpered once but didn't lash out. It seemed to understand. That night, Evelyn barely slept. She watched the cub breathe, watched its chest rise and fall, wondered what story lay behind its pain. Maybe the mother had been shot by a poacher. Maybe they'd gotten separated during an early storm. Maybe it was just bad luck. The woods had a way of rewriting fate without warning. She gave the cub a name. Ash. It reminded her of something burnt but still alive. Over the next few days, Evelyn and Ash settled into a rhythm. He slept most of the time, curled near the fire. She fed him softened berries, mashed fish, even the broth from boiled greens. Slowly, his strength returned. When he tried to walk again, he cried out once and collapsed. She fashioned a splint from willow branches and bound his leg with cloth torn from her flannel shirts. "We'll get there," she told him gently. "One day at a time." The snow deepened outside. Evelyn's world shrank to the inside of the cabin and the slow healing of a creature who shouldn't have survived. She talked to Ash like he understood. Maybe he did. When the wind howled against the walls, she read aloud from old books, her voice the only steady thing in the storm. She wasn't sure who needed the stories more, him or her. For the first time in years, the loneliness lifted, just a little. Then something strange began to happen. On the fifth night, just before dawn, Evelyn woke to a sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual creak of timber or sigh of settling snow. It was humming. Low, almost musical. She sat up, heart skipping. The sound seemed to come from Ash. He was still asleep, but his body shimmered faintly, like the air around him bent in soft waves. Evelyn blinked. It stopped. Silence returned. She wondered if it had been a dream. But the next night, it happened again. And this time, Ash's eyes opened, and he looked straight at her. Not like an animal. Not like a cub. There was something behind those eyes, something old. Something knowing. The fire cracked. Her breath caught. Ash closed his eyes again, and the shimmer vanished. Evelyn didn't tell anyone. Who was there to tell? But she began to watch more closely. Ash healed faster than he should have. The leg, which should have taken months, seemed nearly strong by the 10th day. The strange glow returned each night just before dawn. Always brief. Always silent. As though the forest itself was touching him, weaving something back together. And sometimes, Evelyn thought she heard whispers. Not in the room. In her mind. Not words. Feelings. Memories she hadn't summoned. Her mother's voice. A lost friend's laughter. The sound of the river the day her husband died. Ash would be staring at her when it happened, still and calm. She didn't understand. But she felt no fear. Only wonder. The snow hadn't stopped falling, and the path back to the cabin felt twice as long with the added weight of the cub in her arms. Not heavy, he couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, but dense, his fur thick with melting frost and his breathing so shallow it frightened her. Every few steps, she would pause to make sure he was still alive. Each faint puff of breath against her coat reassured her just enough to press forward. Her legs burned. The wind bit at her cheeks. But she didn't loosen her grip. The cabin door creaked as she shouldered it open. A rush of heat welcomed her in, and with it the scent of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of the vegetable stew she had abandoned earlier. She laid the cub gently on the woven rug before the fireplace and added 2 more logs, watching the flames swell with an urgency that matched her own. He needed warmth. He needed help. And she needed to believe this wasn't a lost cause. She fetched a towel and began patting him dry, gently, almost reverently. His fur was a mess of twigs, ice, and something sticky she couldn't quite identify. She worked slowly, whispering to him. "I've got you now. You're safe here." He didn't respond. Not even a blink. When he was as dry as she could manage, she wrapped him in one of her old flannel shirts and tucked a hot water bottle beside him. His little paws twitched now and then. She hoped it meant life was stirring back in. "You're a fighter," she murmured. "You wouldn't have made it this far if you weren't." The storm outside howled louder, rattling the shutters and forcing her attention momentarily away from the cub. She moved through the cabin, checking the windows, making sure nothing would blow open. But her mind stayed with the creature on her floor. She returned to find one of his eyes barely cracked open. Amber, just like she thought. Tired. Frightened. But awake. Her heart thudded with cautious relief. She knelt beside him and reached out slowly, fingers trembling not from the cold but from hope. When her hand touched the fur of his head, he didn't flinch. She spent the rest of the night beside him, dozing in her armchair, waking at every shift or sigh he made. She fed him drops of warm honey water from a spoon, and once, when he let out a weak whimper, she wrapped him in her arms like she might a child. The gesture surprised her. She hadn't held anything that tenderly in years. Not since her daughter. She didn't let her thoughts go there. Not now. Not when life was trying so hard to hang on. Morning came late, masked by clouds and snowfall that refused to relent. But it was a new day. The cub had moved, only slightly, but his head now rested on the edge of the folded towel. She smiled at the small change. "You're tougher than you look," she said aloud, rising to fix herself some tea. The kettle screamed a bit too loud for her liking, and when she turned back, the cub's ears twitched. Progress. She set her cup aside and fetched a bowl of mashed oatmeal mixed with goat's milk. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. She dipped her finger in and gently traced it along the cub's lips. No reaction at first. Then, sluggishly, his tongue flicked out. She held her breath. Another flick. Then, very slowly, he tried to swallow. "Yes," she whispered. "That's it. Keep going." Feeding him took the better part of the hour, but by the end of it, he had taken a few teaspoons. Enough to keep trying. Enough to make her believe she hadn't brought him in just to watch him die in comfort. The day passed quietly. She wrapped the cub in a wool blanket and set him on the couch near the fire. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. The trees no longer bowed under the weight of snow, the wind fell to a whisper. She looked out the window often, wondering if a mother bear was out there searching, or if this little one had already been abandoned by nature's cruel calendar. She didn't want to think about that either. That evening, she sat beside him again and read aloud from the book she kept on the shelf above the stove. A collection of old mountain stories, legends of creatures both real and imagined. It was silly, she thought. But something about the act of storytelling made the cabin feel less like a place of survival and more like a home again. And then, for the first time, the cub moved on his own. Not much, just a soft, crawling effort to push his head into her lap. But it was enough. Enough to make her throat tighten and her eyes burn with the kind of tears she hadn't allowed in years. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, resting her hand on his head. "We're both going to be okay." As night fell, the fire crackled a little softer, the wind gave up its tantrum, and the forest outside lay still. But inside, the tiny miracle of survival flickered brighter than ever. She didn't have a name for him yet. That would come. But in her heart, he was no longer just a freezing cub she'd stumbled upon in the snow. He was something she hadn't known she needed. Something more than rescue. Something closer to grace. The next morning brought more than just light through the cabin windows. It brought a sound, a shuffle, followed by a soft thud that startled her awake. She had dozed in the armchair again, arms crossed, one slipper missing and the mug of tea beside her gone cold. But the noise? It wasn't the firewood shifting, nor the wind. It was from the couch. She sat upright and saw him, half on, half off the cushion, his back legs tangled awkwardly in the folds of the blanket. His little claws scraped the wood floor, and his snout trembled with the effort. He was trying to stand. Her hand flew to her mouth, then slowly lowered. "Oh, sweetheart, not yet," she murmured, rising quickly and rushing over. The cub grunted, a soft, weak sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. He tried again to lift himself, only for his legs to give out and collapse beneath him. He whimpered, and it wasn't just the pain in his body. She saw it. The frustration. It was instinct. He wasn't made to lie still forever. Bears were meant to move, to climb, to run. And in that moment, this cub, no bigger than a house cat, was aching to remember what it meant to be alive. She knelt beside him, one hand cradling the back of his head, the other steadying his shoulder. "Easy now," she said gently. "You're rushing it. You need rest first. There's no one out there chasing us, okay?" But she understood. And maybe, deep down, some part of her wanted to push forward too. Because taking care of him had become more than just a rescue mission. It gave her purpose again, routine. Wake, check his breathing, boil the oats, mix in the honey, warm the blanket, clean his paws, check the wound. Repeat. That wound. It was healing, slowly, but the gash on his hind leg still worried her. She had cleaned it with warm water and balm made from pine sap, wrapped it with gauze she hadn't used since her husband's accident in the mountains, years ago. She had promised herself then she wouldn't need any of that again. But here she was. The cub blinked up at her, those amber eyes full of quiet pain and fierce determination. She could see it, he wanted to walk again. Run, even. But right now, he was stuck between what his body remembered and what it could still do. "You'll get there," she promised, brushing a bit of dried snow from his fur. "You just need time." She took him off the couch and laid him near the fire once more, positioning a few pillows so he could sit upright. He watched her move around the room, his eyes tracking her with the quiet focus of a wild thing trying to decide if the world had turned kind again. She moved gently. She hummed when she fed the stove. And she read aloud in the evenings because she had run out of things to say and the sound of her voice seemed to soothe them both. By mid-afternoon, she had rigged a small sling from an old scarf and gently guided his hindquarters into it, supporting his weight as he tried again to rise. This time, he managed to stand for 3 full seconds. She counted. Then he tumbled sideways into her arms. And that was the moment she almost cried. Not because he failed, but because he tried. And because he didn't give up. That night, she opened her old trunk. It hadn't been opened in years, not since her daughter had moved away, not since the last photo had been taken. Inside were things she had folded and put away for good: tiny socks, a frayed baby blanket, a drawing of their cabin with stick figures and stars drawn in colored pencil. She hadn't meant to go through it all. But the cub, his smallness, his helplessness, it stirred something in her. Grief, yes. But also tenderness. She closed the trunk and sat down near the fire again. The cub was sleeping, his paws twitching in some sort of dream. Maybe he was running there, in his mind. Maybe he was home again. Or maybe he had accepted this place, this quiet room filled with crackling warmth, as something safe enough to rest in. When he stirred in his sleep, she reached down and touched his side. He didn't wake, but he shifted closer to her hand. She whispered to the flames, not expecting them to answer. "You picked a hell of a time to show up, little one. I thought I was done taking care of things." But maybe. She didn't finish the sentence. Some words weren't meant to be spoken aloud. That night, as the moon rose over the frozen trees, she heard another sound, soft, rhythmic breathing beside her. And then, a tiny snore. Barely audible, but real. She laughed, quietly, more of a breath than a sound. She hadn't laughed like that in years. And she didn't want to stop. The blizzard that had swallowed the mountains was long gone, but the cold still wrapped around the cabin like a memory that refused to leave. Even indoors, where the fire cracked and hissed with fresh logs, the air carried a sharpness that only winter understands. She kept her coat draped around the cub whenever she wasn't using it herself, and some nights, when the wind howled loudest through the trees, she would press her back against his side as they both slept near the fire. The first time she felt his warmth return against hers, she wept silently into the darkness. He had begun to sit up now. His eyes followed her more deliberately, less out of fear and more like recognition. Sometimes, when she spoke softly while chopping vegetables or stitching the seams of his blanket, he would respond with a low huff or a blink. She began reading aloud to him, not because she thought he understood the words, but because her voice seemed to comfort him. He especially perked up when she read old forest poems, full of animals and rivers and stories of wild things that always found their way home. But it was one night, after a long silence, that something different happened. The moon was full. That perfect silver coin, frozen in the sky, casting long shadows across the snowbanks. The cabin was bathed in pale light through its frosted windows. She'd fallen asleep with her journal open beside her, a pencil still between her fingers. The bear cub had been curled up near the hearth, his breath deep and steady. But around midnight, something stirred. She didn't hear it at first, not the sound, but the stillness. A stillness too deliberate to be part of normal sleep. She opened her eyes slowly. The fire had dimmed, just embers now, glowing like coals in the dark. And there, standing by the window, was the cub. Not sitting. Not slumped. Standing. On all fours, shoulders firm, head lifted toward the light. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking for food. He was looking through the window at the snow-covered forest beyond. And his body didn't tremble. Not even a little. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She knew something was happening, something private, instinctual. Sacred, even. His fur glowed faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, he looked like a statue. Or something older than a statue. Like a creature carved from the earth, not born from it. The pain in his legs, once sharp and constant, seemed gone, if only for that moment. He wasn't just healing. He was remembering something. Remembering what it meant to be wild. She saw it in the way he exhaled, slow and soft, like he was testing his strength not with force, but with presence. As if standing was a kind of prayer. Or a promise. She stayed frozen, watching as he lowered his head slightly toward the window, nose almost touching the glass. The stars above shimmered like frost scattered across velvet. His ears flicked once, then again, and he let out a single sound. Not a growl. Not a whimper. Just a breath. A low sound, part sigh, part question. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. Only heard. After a few minutes, he turned slowly, limped back to the blanket near the fire, and curled up again. But this time, when he rested his head, it wasn't with the heaviness of a creature in pain. It was peaceful. Intentional. He was choosing to sleep, not collapsing into it. she closed her eyes too. Her heart felt stretched between awe and sorrow. She knew then this cabin was a cocoon, not a cage. And one day, maybe sooner than she wanted to admit, it would open. And he would leave. But not yet. He still needed warmth, food, rest. But she could feel it, that invisible clock that ticked not with minutes, but with memories. And in that moment, she wasn't afraid of the day he would go. She was afraid of not being ready to let him. Morning came gently, and with it, a sky full of pastel light. The cub remained asleep longer than usual. Maybe the night had exhausted him in new ways. Or maybe it had strengthened something deep inside that needed quiet to settle. When he did wake, he met her eyes with calmness. There was no panic. No leftover tremble from old pain. Just a shared knowing. He had remembered something last night. And so had she. That some creatures are not meant to be saved from the world, they are meant to return to it, whole again. That winter morning was quieter than most. The wind had lost its sharp edges, brushing against the cabin like the gentlest of whispers. The fire inside burned steady, giving off the kind of warmth that didn't shout, just stayed. Outside, the world was still white, but it no longer felt like a trap, it felt like a pause. The cub had returned inside after his brave steps into the snow the day before. His energy was better, his legs steadier, though there was still a limp in the back right paw. She'd stopped wrapping it now, only watching closely in case the swelling came back. But it hadn't. Not yet. He seemed to be healing on his own. The stubborn little heartbeat she'd carried in her coat was no longer a helpless creature. He was starting to be himself. But even with that change, there was something else she noticed. He wouldn't eat unless she was there. At first, she thought it was coincidence. She'd set out the little bowl, half milk, half softened oats, and step into the other room to change her socks or stoke the fire. She'd come back 5 minutes later and find it untouched. Then she'd sit. Sometimes near him. Sometimes across the room. And slowly, he'd approach, sniff, and begin to eat. It happened again the next day. And again after that. She tried waiting in the kitchen, peeking around the corner, testing the theory. But no, he knew when she wasn't near, even if he couldn't see her. His small pink nose would hover over the food, then retreat. His ears would flick, his body curl back into a corner. And yet the moment she sat, especially when she whispered something soft like, "Go on, it's okay," he'd walk over and start chewing with slow, careful bites. He wasn't afraid. That much was clear. He didn't shake when she moved, didn't flinch when she reached for the kettle or stretched her legs near him. This wasn't fear keeping him from eating. It was trust. Or the fragile idea of it. Some animals, she knew, just learned to associate presence with safety. Others went further. They built habits around attachment, the same way children did. Not needing constant comfort, but preferring it. Requiring it, even, to feel whole. He was like that. Not needy. Not weak. Just anchored to her in a way that broke her open a little more every day. She sat with him at each meal now. Never talking much. Sometimes humming without realizing it. She'd learned by now he didn't like loud clinking or scraping metal. He preferred wooden spoons. Soft motions. Her humming. Always her humming. By the end of the week, he had outgrown the little bowl. His appetite had doubled, and his confidence with it. He pawed at the wood near the fire when he wanted more. He nudged her knee when he was bored. She laughed once, just a sharp, surprised little chuckle, and he spun around like he wasn't sure whether to be startled or delighted. She laughed again, softer this time, and he took it in stride. They were learning each other. At night, he didn't sleep on the coat anymore. He still lay near it, but now he had dragged a pillow from the chair and curled against it like it was a snowbank. She hadn't taught him to do that. It just happened. One moment he was dragging it, awkward and clumsy, the next he was settled on top, one paw across the corner like a claim. And he dreamed there, twitching sometimes, making small muffled huffs in his sleep. She'd wake and watch him. Sometimes it scared her, how attached she was. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because the deeper she let herself go, the more it would hurt when he left. Not if. When. He was a bear. Even as a cub, he belonged to the wild, and she knew this from the first moment he opened his eyes. Still, she stayed with him through every meal. Not to make him dependent. Not to raise a pet. But because he asked her in the only way he knew how. By refusing to eat unless she was there. The weather had turned again, less cruel now, more unpredictable. It would snow lightly in the morning, melt by noon, and harden into icy crust by nightfall. Trees groaned with weight they didn't have the strength to carry. Icicles fell like quiet daggers from the roof. She'd learned to step carefully when walking out front. But inside, everything was changing in a different kind of way. The bear cub, once fragile and trembling, had become restless. Not in the chaotic, anxious way, but with an energy that had nowhere to go. Like a child at the start of spring. He had grown in size and, somehow, cleverness too. His eyes followed her longer. He began to mimic her without understanding. When she swept the floor with her old corn broom, he reached a paw toward it and nudged it awkwardly, then looked at her as if asking, "Was that right?" She began giving him scraps to carry, cloths, small twigs for the fireplace, a spoon from the floor. And each time, he'd take it in his mouth or awkward paws and deliver it with a dramatic little spin. He liked the praise. Or maybe it wasn't praise. Maybe it was her smile. He lived for that smile now, and she was beginning to realize how much she lived for his, even if it came in the shape of a twitching nose and curious grunt. Then came the log. It was early. Cold breath still clung to the cabin windows. She was bent over the woodpile beside the stove, choosing pieces for the day, when she heard the dragging sound, soft at first, then urgent. She turned and saw him, face wrinkled in concentration, pulling a chunk of firewood toward the front door. Not one of the small sticks. A real log. Heavy. Fresh. He dropped it with a thud and stared at her. At first, she laughed. A short, surprised sound. Then she blinked. He stared at the door. Back at her. Then the door again. "Are you trying to go outside?" she asked aloud, voice barely more than a whisper. He pawed the log. Looked back. She opened the door. And to her astonishment, he didn't rush out. He waited. Sat right down next to it, one paw still resting on the log like a reminder. She walked past him, curious, stepping onto the icy porch. He followed. That was the first time he led her. Out in the yard, the snow was firm but shallow. Patches of frozen leaves peeked through like bruises. He nudged at the trees with his nose, sniffed the air, then ran in a clumsy circle. Then stopped. She stood in place, breath clouding in the still morning light. He turned back, padded toward her, and nudged her knee with his head. It was, unmistakably, an invitation. From then on, the games began. It started with the log. Every morning, like clockwork, he'd find it or something like it, a stick, a pine cone, once even a frozen boot she'd left on the back porch, and drag it to the door. It became his ritual. The offering. The unspoken message, let's go. She indulged him. They didn't go far. Just around the cabin sometimes, or to the edge of the tree line where the snow lay deepest. She made paths with her boots. He followed with lopsided hops. Occasionally, he'd pounce forward, half falling, and she'd pretend to gasp, feigning surprise. One day, he climbed on top of a snow mound and perched like a sentinel, chest puffed out, head high. She saluted him. He chirped an odd, bear-like squeak she hadn't heard before. A sound of delight. And she realized he was playing. He wasn't just surviving now. Not just healing. He was becoming something. Someone. And in his own way, he was asking her to become part of that world. Not just as his rescuer or caretaker, but as his companion. That night, after one of their short outdoor circuits, he didn't curl into the corner. He dragged the pillow closer to her chair and flopped onto it with a sigh. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, lightly, respectfully, like she always did, and he melted into it. No longer the broken thing in her arms. Now, a little soul building his own kind of joy, one small log at a time. The rhythm they had built was quiet but strong, like the ticking of an old clock whose every tick had meaning. Every morning now began the same way. She would wake before dawn, light the stove, and wait for the scrape or thud of whatever object he decided was worthy to drag to the door. Sometimes it was bark. Sometimes a tin cup from the porch. Once it was a soggy slipper, and she had laughed so hard she startled a flock of birds into flight from the trees nearby. Each gesture said, "I'm ready. Let's go." But that morning, there was nothing. Not a scrape. Not a snuffle. Not even the sound of his pawing at the side of the cabin, something he did when the object was too big to fit through the door frame. Just silence. She waited 5 minutes, then 10. Then she opened the door. Outside, the world had changed overnight. A storm had come through, not a snowstorm, but a wet, heavy rain that melted the surface snow and soaked everything underneath. The trees were black with wet bark. The ground was slush and mud. The roof dripped steadily, each drop a small needle of tension in the silence. Still no sign of him. She stepped out barefoot, not even realizing it until the freezing water bit into her toes. Her coat was wrapped hastily around her shoulders, and she grabbed the flashlight even though it was mid-morning. Something felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. Her breath was tight in her throat. She followed the familiar paw prints, only they weren't fresh. They were from yesterday. Hard edges already dulled by the thaw. She called out once, not loudly, but enough to stir the quiet, little guy. She still hadn't settled on a name for him. He had never needed one. But now the emptiness where his presence should have been made her voice sound foolish. She crossed the yard, then the edge of the woods, searching for broken branches or signs of him. Nothing. Only wet leaves, the damp smell of earth, and that suffocating quiet. Then, she saw the log. It was lying a few feet from the path, a fresh one, still covered in moss and bark. Half rolled, as if it had slipped from someone's grip. She rushed to it. Beside it, paw prints. Fresh. Deep. Uneven. And then, blood. A single smear, hardly more than a thumbprint in the mud. But it was enough. Her heart clenched. Every instinct screamed to run, but she forced herself to breathe. To move slowly. She followed the trail, sporadic prints, some dragged, some clear, until she reached the thicket behind the cabin, where the underbrush had thickened with thorns. A perfect hiding place. If he was hurt, he'd gone there to be safe. She crouched and called again, this time lower, softer. And then, from the darkest part of the underbrush, a sound. A whimper. Relief hit her so hard she nearly fell forward. She crawled into the thorns, hands scratched, mud soaking through her sleeves, until she saw the brown curve of fur. He was curled up tightly, one paw beneath him, shivering. She reached for him, but he flinched. Hey, she whispered. It's me. When she finally got close enough to see clearly, her breath caught. A gash ran down the side of his back leg. Not deep, but raw and open. The kind of wound that would never heal properly out here alone. Probably a fall on the wet stones. Maybe he had slipped while carrying the log or tripped over the broken ice. She didn't waste a second. Without speaking, she pulled him into her lap the way she had done the night she found him. Only now, he was twice the size and the pain in his eyes made him resist. He whimpered, but he didn't fight. She held him and waited. After several minutes, she stood, cradling as much of his weight as she could, and limped back through the mud, into the cabin. Her legs shook. Her arms burned. But she didn't stop. Inside, she wrapped him in every blanket she owned. Cleaned the wound. Applied ointment. Whispered to him like he was a frightened child and not a wild animal with teeth and claws. All the while, the rain poured on. The day never brightened. The sky stayed bruised and weeping, and she sat there with him for hours, not eating, not moving. Just breathing with him. Watching the rise and fall of his chest. Watching his eyes slowly close, not from pain this time, but from trust. It was the first time she realized what true fear felt like, not when the snowstorm came, not when she first found him, but now, when she had something she loved, and it might be taken away. That night, she didn't sleep in her bed. She curled up next to him on the floor, and when the fire died low, she pulled another quilt over them both. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside, the silence had broken. And that silence had taught her what it meant to care for something that couldn't say thank you, couldn't promise to stay, but had chosen, somehow, to trust her anyway. Days passed in a hush of healing. She checked his wound every morning and again before bed, washing it with warm water boiled over the stove. At first, he wouldn't let her near it. But gradually, the flinching stopped. He didn't resist her touch. He let her fingers smooth over his fur, let her inspect the torn flesh. When she whispered to him, he no longer looked away. His eyes followed her voice. Sometimes, after she'd tended the gash, he would rest his head on her knee and close his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from peace. It was late autumn now. The last of the leaves had fallen in a sweep of wind that sent flocks of birds wheeling across the sky. The air smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. She had split enough logs to get her through December, but January still loomed. The bear cub, bigger now, stronger, was no longer the helpless bundle she'd carried in from the snow. He still limped slightly, but he moved with confidence again. He followed her as she walked the edge of the woods, and when she disappeared inside the shed or behind the coop, he circled near the cabin like a sentinel. It was on one of those quiet days, when the frost had started forming on the trees again, that it happened. She had gone out just past sunrise to gather the trap line near the ravine. She rarely left the cub behind anymore, but this time, he had seemed content by the fire, dozing with one paw twitching in his sleep. so she left quietly, her steps muffled in the moss and needles. She didn't plan to be long. But the ravine was further than she remembered in the cold, and when she found one of the traps empty but bloodied, she spent precious time searching nearby in case the animal was caught elsewhere. She never liked leaving anything to suffer, not even a rabbit. That mercy, as it turned out, would cost her. On her way back, she heard a snap. Not from a branch. It was too sharp. Too deliberate. Then the silence shifted, the way forests do when something big is moving just beyond sight. She froze. Her eyes scanned the trees. And then she saw it. A wolf. Not just any wolf, but a massive male, gray and black and lean from hunger. Its ribs showed beneath its pelt. Its eyes were yellow and locked on her. No sound. No snarl. Just that look, measuring the distance between them. She didn't carry a rifle anymore. She hadn't needed to. Not since the cub had come. She had grown used to his company, his shadow. But now, alone and unarmed, she was reminded just how fragile she was out here. She backed up slowly, not breaking eye contact. But the wolf followed. Each step she took, it mirrored. She wasn't sure how far she had to go before the cub might hear her, if he was even awake. Her heart pounded. She could feel the weight of every mistake, every footstep, every second she had been gone too long. Then the wolf growled. It was low, deep, and full of intent. She stumbled slightly but didn't turn her back. And that's when it happened. A sound behind her, a rustle, a thud, then the crash of paws through the brush. The cub. He barreled past her in a blur of fur and urgency, a guttural roar erupting from his throat that she had never heard before. Not playful. Not soft. This was something primal, ancient. He placed himself between her and the wolf, shoulders hunched, teeth bared. And the wolf stopped. It hesitated, assessing. The cub was still small by wild standards, but his stance was unwavering. He didn't move. Didn't blink. He stood as if the entire forest had been his territory for years. The wolf took a step back. Then another. It didn't run. It simply turned, disappeared into the trees like a shadow melting into shadow. And the cub, her cub, turned around slowly, eyes meeting hers. He let out a small sound, half a grunt, half a whine, then rubbed his head against her arm as if to ask, "Are you okay?" She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. She didn't cry, not until later, but in that moment, something inside her shifted. He had saved her. Not out of instinct. Not out of defense of food or territory. Out of loyalty. Out of love. That night, back in the cabin, she fed him the last of the preserved salmon. He deserved it. He licked her hand after every bite. She added more logs to the fire, even though they'd planned to ration. And when he curled up beside her, warm and safe, she let her hand rest on his side, feeling the steady thump of his heart against her palm. She whispered, "You found me, didn't you?" Not the other way around. The snow had begun to fall again outside. But inside the cabin, there was only warmth. It was deep into December when the storm began to whisper through the treetops like a warning. The clouds had been gathering for days, thickening like smoke above the forest ridge. She knew the signs well, the sudden hush of wildlife, the sharp drop in temperature, the way her breath hung in the air like ghosts that refused to move on. Even the cub seemed uneasy, pacing the cabin floor as if sensing something he couldn't understand. She did what she always did before storms, stocked the woodpile high beside the stove, filled every pot with water, brought in extra blankets from the old chest at the back of the room. But this time, her preparations had an extra urgency. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone to protect. The storm came at night. Not as snow at first, but as wind, howling, unrelenting, slamming against the sides of the cabin with fists made of ice. The windows rattled in their frames. The roof groaned. Outside, trees bent low, the branches screeching as if the sky were tearing them apart. Then the snow came, sideways, thick and furious, erasing everything in white. She stayed close to the stove with the bear cub beside her. He didn't try to play or explore. He simply pressed against her side, warm and quiet, his eyes alert. She wrapped him in a wool blanket, and for the first time, he didn't struggle against it. He stayed there for hours, unmoving, like a sentinel with his ear pressed to her heartbeat. But it wasn't enough. By dawn, the roof had started leaking, a steady drip from a crack above the bed. The front door was packed with snow. She had to dig it out 3 times before midday just to keep it from sealing shut. She could barely see beyond the porch, the wind was that thick. The power, unreliable even in good weather, had gone out some time before midnight. It was just them and the fire now. On the second night, the real danger began. The firewood stack was nearly gone. She hadn't expected a storm like this, not one that would last this long, cut them off this completely. No birds, no sky, no sound but wind. The snow had drifted higher than the windows. She was trapped in her own home, and worse, so was he. And he was still healing. His body, though stronger now, wasn't made to endure starvation or exposure so soon again. She looked at him sleeping near the hearth, chest rising and falling slowly. His fur was dusted with ash and pine smoke. He looked peaceful. But she could feel the weight of every shiver, every cold breath in the air. She knew what would happen if the fire died. The temperature inside the cabin had already dropped. Her fingers were numb even as she chopped the last log into kindling. Then she made a decision. She'd seen an old stump behind the cabin, half buried under snow. It was solid birch. Dry inside. If she could get to it, just for a few logs, maybe they could last another day. Just enough time for the storm to pass. She bundled herself in everything she had. 3 layers of socks. 2 scarves. A coat so patched it looked like a quilt. The bear cub stirred, following her movements. "You stay," she whispered. "I'll be right back." But he whimpered. When she opened the door, the wind nearly knocked her back. She had to crawl through the snow, inch by inch, using the cabin wall for support. Her breath was gone in seconds. The cold burned her cheeks and throat. It wasn't snow anymore, it was needles of ice, flaying every inch of exposed skin. She reached the stump, scraped at it with her axe, hands raw, body shaking. It took everything in her to drag just 2 chunks of wood back to the porch. And then she collapsed. Face down in the snow. She couldn't feel her legs. Her fingers no longer worked. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the storm. She saw the cabin light, just a flicker from the window, and knew she'd never reach it. Then suddenly, heat. A shadow moved across her vision. Paws. Heavy ones. The cub. He had forced the cabin door open with his body. He had come for her. He nudged her arm, whimpered, then gripped her sleeve gently between his teeth and pulled. She thought she was dreaming, hallucinating. But he didn't stop. He dragged her, inch by inch, through the snow, through the wind, back toward the flickering glow of the stove. He paused every few steps to adjust his grip, to look back and make sure she was still breathing. And somehow, he got her there. She barely remembered the door closing or the warmth swallowing her limbs again. Only that she woke up hours later, wrapped in every blanket in the cabin, the fire roaring, and the cub beside her, pressed close, as if trying to keep her alive with the heat of his own body. She cried then. Silently. Tears streaming down frozen skin, thawed only by the miracle beside her. She'd saved him once. But now he had saved her? Not because he owed her. Not because he was trained to. Because he cared. Because he refused to let her go. As the storm finally began to break that evening, the wind dying into a gentle sigh, she whispered, "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" And in answer, the cub lifted his head, nudged her chin gently, and let out a low, comforting sound that sounded like yes. Spring arrived in the forest not as a sudden warmth, but as a slow forgetting of winter. Icicles wept into puddles. The snow receded, revealing the mossy earth underneath like a long-lost friend. The wind stopped biting and began to sing again. Buds pushed out from branches that had once seemed lifeless. And with the melt came the change she had been dreading but knew was inevitable. The bear cub wasn't a cub anymore. He had grown stronger with every week, every warm meal, every walk beyond the cabin where his limbs stretched and his breath came easier. His wounds were long gone now. His eyes shone with something deeper, not only intelligence, but confidence. Wildness. The kind she had feared he would lose but secretly prayed he would find again. He had begun wandering farther from the cabin. At first, only to the edge of the clearing, returning within minutes, never letting her out of sight. But then the forest called more insistently. He disappeared for an hour. Then a morning. And then one day, as she brewed tea and set down 2 bowls like always, one for her, one for him, she realized the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. She waited by the door all day. But he didn't return. And somehow, she knew. It was time. She walked into the woods that evening, down the path they had taken so many times together. She found paw prints in the soft earth, fresh and sure, heading deeper into the trees. Not the clumsy, uneven prints of a broken cub, but steady, adult tracks. Wild again. She knelt beside one and touched the edge of the print with her fingers. Her breath caught in her throat. It was goodbye, not abandonment. A choice. The kind that only love makes possible. He had left while the world was soft again, while the trees were green, while she was safe. He had waited until he was sure she would be okay without him. Just like she had waited months ago, watching over him as he healed in the warmth of her coat. In that moment, she didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, more than anything. But because what they had built was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to save them both. It had done exactly that. And now, he belonged to the wild again. She returned to the cabin with a hollow in her chest, but also a fire, one that wouldn't go out. She left the door open that night, just in case. And again the night after. But she didn't expect him anymore. Not really. She simply honored the space he'd filled. Weeks passed. The forest bloomed in full. She repaired the roof. Repaired her own bones. She wrote it all down, not just to remember, but to understand. To remind herself it had been real. Sometimes, in the evening light, she would look toward the edge of the trees and think she saw movement. But it was always just the wind, or a deer, or her heart playing tricks. Until one night. A soft sound on the porch. She froze, tea halfway to her lips. A scrape. Then a low grunt. She rushed to the door. There he stood. Taller now. Stronger. His coat full and glossy, glowing golden in the setting sun. A scar still visible above one eye, her stitching had never been perfect. But his eyes were the same. So was the way he huffed at her, lowered his head as if to say, just checking. He didn't come inside. He didn't need to. She stepped forward, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, the way she used to. He leaned into it for a moment. Then he turned, walked back into the trees, and disappeared. She never saw him again. But that was enough. One last time. One last touch. A thank you. The seasons rolled on. The cabin aged. So did she. The story of the cub became something she only shared once in a great while, usually when someone asked why she had a bear carved into her gate, or why the back wall was covered in sketches of paw prints and stars. But every winter, when the snow came thick and the fire was lit high, she would open the door for a moment, just long enough to feel the cold on her cheeks. Just in case. And every spring, she followed the same trail into the woods, where the first green shoots broke through the earth. Sometimes she'd find fresh prints. Sometimes not. But always, she remembered. The girl who found a bear. The woman who was saved by him. She wasn't lonely anymore, not in the way she once was. Love, even love that leaves, never really goes. It reshapes everything. It stays in the soil, in the wind, in the heartbeats that echo through silence. That final winter, when her time came, neighbors found her in the cabin, peaceful, still, wrapped in the same coat she once wrapped around a bear cub. The fire still burned. The windows frosted with gentle snow. And on the porch, paw prints. Large ones. Fresh. Leading to the door. And then away again.